This is Andrew Ridgie on Hospitality and Politics. We're going to be talking about the politics today. The show is powered by the New York City Hospitality Alliance. Today I have a great guest, Ben Max. He is a veteran journalist on city and state politics. He's a host of Max Politics, which makes sense because his name is Ben Max. He gives in-depth interviews on city and state government with all different people who know these worlds inside out. And he is the executive editor and program director for the Center of New York City Law at the New York Law School. Hello.
Hello.
How you
Thanks for
doing?
having me. Good.
Good. So, where do we even start here? So, what's your thought? Obviously, it's the end of 2025. We are heading into a new year with a new mayor incoming, a new city council. There's so much going on. So many people have so many different hot takes about the future of the city. And we'll definitely drill down into a lot of those different specifics. But just like at a high level, reporting on politics for so many years, having your podcast, what's your sense and what's your overall feeling of the new year and the new political climate?
Yeah, it's such an interesting time because, you know, the last time we had a mayor leaving, it was Bill de Blasio after 8 years. Everyone was like pretty ready for him to go. Even some of the people who liked his policies. It was, 2 terms. It was kind of like, and then of course COVID at the end was really rough for everybody. And it was, people were sort of ready for new leadership. There's a lot of people ready for Eric Adams to go as well as mayor, but for just one term, there's like some wrestling with his term and his legacy we need to do. So I'm thinking a bit about that. And I think that, that needs to be given its attention, even though everybody's ready to move on to the Mamdani administration.
Sure.
All that. That, of course, is important. We're looking at appointments and all of that. As we're speaking here, we're expecting a bunch more appointments to be coming any moment. And then you get into the 2026 election year, which is going to be so big for New York and the country. So those are a few of the top lines on my mind right now. But then hanging over all of that, of course, is the Trump presidency and the policies coming out of Washington. What's that going to look like? We saw this incredible Zohran Mamdani, Donald Trump meeting, but who knows where it goes after that. But then just broadly, the city is in a, what do we want to say? Tricky place, right? There's a lot of good things happening. There's been a lot of strong recovery coming out of COVID, but there's a lot of challenges. Zohran Mamdani got elected because he was speaking to the broader issues of affordability that so many people and businesses and entities and organizations are struggling with. And so that's, so much of what's at the forefront right now.
Yeah. It is surely a lot. I represent the hospitality lines, restaurants, bars, nightclubs, across the 5 boroughs. So you have every different type of establishment to varying degrees. And I guess it's the same in just the general public. People are tuned in to what's happening in government and how it affects them. And, for so long, small businesses around the city have always felt like New York City's the greatest place. There's so much opportunity to open up new restaurants, bars, nightlife venues, but it's also among the most challenging places. Not just because of the competition, because government imposes so many mandates, so many complex regulations. So they are just naturally tuned in. Even if they're not political, it's hard not to be political when an inspector comes in and starts writing all these violations to your small business. And that's what we do at the Alliances. We're in the halls of government advocating for them. But I think and maybe just people that are closely aligned to politics in general take for granted like how it works. We hear the mayor, the city council, the speaker, Congress. But maybe we could just talk a little bit about on a high level, like how the city works. What does the mayor do? Like, what is their actual job? Like when we hear agencies, the health department, the Department of Transportation, which is now the agency that oversees the city's outdoor dining program, Department of Consumer Affairs and Worker Protection oversees some of the city level labor laws, and then the city council. So maybe you could just kind of give us a high level overview of, what does the mayor generally do? And then we could talk a little bit about the city council and then move into some of the specific policies.
Yeah, sure. And fill in any gaps that I leave here because you obviously are such an expert on this too. When you think about what the mayor does, I think of it in a couple of ways. One is it's sort of a leadership vision, symbolic job in some ways. And then it's a huge management job. And so, the mayor has to come in and manage the agencies you just named and dozens more, provide basic services on a daily basis, like making sure that the sanitation department picks up the trash, but also running a school system, educating 900,000 kids, and everything in between, right? You have responsibility for setting a lot of the policy agenda for a lot of these agencies, but going back to the way you prompted this, you also have to work with the city council if you want to change any laws, right? A lot of what the mayor oversees that I think is particularly relevant to, your industry and this work is when even the city council passes a law, and of course that could be with the mayor's signature or the mayor allowing it to age into law or the mayor vetoing it and the city council overriding the veto, which has happened a bit under Eric Adams. When that law gets made, very often there's a rulemaking process that follows at the agencies. And, a lot of that is technical, but the mayor and whoever they appoint as a commissioner in those agencies have a lot of say over what the specific rules around how laws actually get implemented are. So that's sort of a key piece of how government works in the city that I think also often gets overlooked is the agency rulemaking process and how that gets shaped. And I know you're often trying to.
We deal with it. I mean, they can't tell you how many times where the city council passes a law, and that's like the broad strokes of what the law is, but then the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of how it's implemented, as you said, is done through rulemaking. And the city council, there's a legislative process, there's public hearings, there's different interests, but it's a different process to try to influence rules. So like we deal with it with outdoor dining. The city council passed this big law, but then a lot of the details came down to the Department of Transportation and their rulemaking process. Right. And unfortunately, some of the things that we don't like got modified in that rulemaking process. And sometimes, you could argue that the intent of the city council when passing the law could even be a little bit different than what the agency is doing in rulemaking and its implementation.
Right. And to that very point and that very policy, the question of putting that program with the Department of Transportation was a big choice that the city council made in writing the law. And then you get a different set of experts dealing with the development of the rules than if you put it at consumer worker protection, which, by the way, the next city council speaker, Julie Menin, was the former commissioner of worker and consumer protection, and she has criticized the fact that the dining program is with DOT. So who knows where that could head? The
because it was with Consumer Affairs and now Consumer Affairs and Worker Protection's the fuller name of the agency. The administration was adamant that it had to move to the Department of Transportation, which had managed outdoor dining during the pandemic. And there were actually a few city council members who were supportive of outdoor dining generally, but did not vote in favor of the outdoor dining law because it was being moved from the Department of Consumer Affairs and Worker Protection to the Department of Transportation, which for various reasons they didn't like or trust to manage it.
Well, and so much of that comes back to this question of roadway dining and how many months of the year and all of that.
Indeed.
Is also a live debate.
Yeah. So it's good. I mean, to think of the mayor as kind of like a CEO. They're the executive of the city. Yes, they play a huge role in all the politics of policy making and, speaking out and, hopefully being a cheerleader for the city. But they are, as you said, Department of Sanitation, picking up the trash, plowing the snow, the schools, really implementing and running this bureaucracy.
And so much of it is hiring well and managing well. And obviously there's huge questions about the incoming mayor, Zohran Mamdani, about who he's going to hire, as I said, but then also, can you get into this seat that is such a pressure cooker, firestorm every day, all of that, and manage well is, a huge challenge for even someone like Michael Bloomberg, who came out of managing a large corporation. So it is really a leadership and management position to a significant degree, but there also are, and this is probably where I think you have positive things to say about the outgoing mayor, Eric Adams, you also are a representative for the city. You have an immense bully pulpit. You lead by example, so a mayor is out there setting the tone for the city, encouraging people to go to the restaurants and nightlife, but then also, perhaps on the other side for the outgoing mayor, you're talking about geopolitics, you're talking about immigration, you're talking about all sorts of issues that can be controversial. you set a unifying tone, you set a divisive tone, all of that. So
yeah, I mean, I have to say,
important.
people have a lot of opinions about, outgoing Mayor Eric Adams, but I have to say from day one, he has been such a champion of restaurants and nightlife, both publicly and privately, talking about being out, going out, encouraging people to go out. And I think that's really important, even putting aside what specific policies are. We just generally, I like to see people that love the city, want to support it, encourage people to come here, go out, support the businesses. And I'm hoping in our mayor-elect, he's done a lot of videos about going out and eating,
Absolutely.
talking about food. Yeah. He's been very supportive of, like the World Cup next year is going to be so exciting, and making sure that all these, local bars and restaurants and neighborhoods across the city get the economic benefits, the social benefits of having, I don't know, 1 million people or something coming for the World Cup and 2 billion people watching it on TV.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great opportunity. But, when you become mayor, it changes from the campaign, talking about ideas, being the cheerleader, to continue to be a cheerleader, and then actually implementing and executing on these complicated policies.
Absolutely. And, to this point, I do think that Zohran Mamdani understands that, a lot of the role of mayor is to be an ambassador for the city. Now, he seems like he's someone who wants to favor a lot of the local eateries and neighborhoods and all of that. That's great. The halal trucks, all the things that he's highlighted during the campaign. But he seems to really understand New York City as a cultural entity. And it'll be very interesting to see just how he approaches that as mayor, because to your point, Eric Adams took a totally different approach than Bill de Blasio, who we know wasn't really out there championing a lot of that. And so I do think, Mamdani has an orientation towards being out and about. Yeah. But once you get into that office, your whole life, his whole life has already changed, as he's recognized. So, it'll be very interesting to see how he approaches that. But I do think he will be, in many ways, see his role as an ambassador for the city and its economy and tourism and all that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So then there's the dynamic with the city council members, who are the ones that pass all of the laws. Can you talk a little bit about just the city council at a high level and what they actually do?
Yeah, so 51 seats in the city council across the 5 boroughs. They legislate, they write laws, they hold oversight hearings, and are supposed to be sort of a check on the mayoral administration and the services and waste, fraud, abuse in city government and all of that, but also just general effectiveness and efficiency in city government. But they also negotiate the city budget, which is, getting us around $120 billion a year now. We're getting up there, somewhere around there, getting close. And they're a key partner with the mayor in negotiating that budget. And the council has to pass the city budget each year. And that's a really important piece of what the city council does. And then the council members are supposed to be, the local representative of their districts and the neighborhoods that make up their districts, to be eyes and ears on the ground, addressing local issues, quality of life, constituent services, all of that, really important. In the city council now, you've got, of the 51 seats, you're going to have something like 46 Democrats. So it's a heavily Democratic body. But of course, in New York City, Democrats come in a lot of different stripes and orientations, but heavily Democratic body, leans liberal to progressive. And they do a lot of legislating. And, one of the things that I've been focused on over the years a little bit is, there's people who say the city council doesn't do enough. And I think that might be true in some ways, but in other ways, they might be doing too much.
Yes.
There's just, and I don't even mean, I'm not even trying to tee you up around, but around regulations and other things that businesses have to deal with. But there's just a lot of legislating that happens constantly. This happens in Albany too. Probably not enough in the federal government. It's very different. But there's a lot of legislation that comes through the council, and there's been more and more of, just to go back to this connection, executive branch, legislative branch, a lot of sort of legislating what executive branch departments and agencies have to do. That's sort of infringing in many cases on what should be the responsibility of the mayor and their commissioners, But in the city council's view, it's to correct operational issues that aren't happening.
Well, reports. I mean, I know that there has been different
reporting,
reviews,
yes.
Is there reporting bills. And I can't even imagine the amount of people hours annually council staff or administration staff does just doing research and preparing reports that in theory are supposed to inform additional policy making that'll probably include additional reporting requirements. And it can take away from just the nuts and bolts of running an efficient government. I mean, I think anyone who runs a business or an organization, nonprofits, I always talk about, bandwidth and prioritizing. It is so easy to go in a million different directions and try to be everything to everyone. I often talk about in like restaurant terms is, a restaurant that tries to be everything to everyone becomes like nothing to anyone, because you need to figure out what's your type of cuisine, what's the ambiance, what's the overall experience. And if you stay true to your core and do things really well, people will love you. Whereas if you're trying to, cook every cuisine, have, a bar, a fine dining, something more casual, you become spread really thin. And I think if you apply that kind of same concept over government is, people want government to be able to deliver vital services, to do it effectively, efficiently. You mentioned the budget. I think when Bloomberg left office, it was something like 70 or less than $70 billion annually, and now it's approaching $120 billion. And I'm just curious if New Yorkers feel like they're getting, that many more $1 billion worth of quality services. I'm sure in some places they are, but I think you could probably argue in others we are not.
Well, this is one thing that's really interesting when you have a democratic socialist, pretty progressive mayor coming into office who's also talking about government effectiveness and what he calls public excellence a lot. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see where he actually approaches efficiency, effectiveness, rethinking programming, rooting out some of the, things that might be a little bit of bloated agencies. But to your point, especially when the city council has layered on, reporting bill after reporting bill, which sometimes, they don't even wind up using the reports to hold oversight hearings or legislate. And they should be helpful in doing those things. And sometimes they are. But when you're layering on those reporting bills, and we've also had a challenge in city government of keeping employees, especially in the COVID and post-COVID era, and hiring people, you have a lot of these challenges at agencies where you do have a very large budget. You do have a lot that city government does, but you also clearly see challenges in execution at a lot of agencies where I know Zohran Mamdani points this out, restaurant inspections and things like that. Now, maybe you don't want all the restaurant inspections that haven't been done. I'm not sure, but just just being able to fulfill the sort of mandates and the requirements and have an effective and efficient government. And that'll be interesting to see how he approaches agency budgets, personnel policies, hiring, working with the unions on the next labor contracts will be really interesting. So there's a lot there to sort of managing the city government and the personnel, especially at agencies. Yeah.
Well, I think the chain of command and how he sets that up, you mentioned Bloomberg, who's always credited with being this excellent manager. And I have to say, I remember working in our advocacy and, he appointed commissioners and it was basically like he trusted them. He gave them a lot of authority. It was like, don't embarrass me. If I give you something that I want done, you have to get it done. Other than that, I appointed you because I trust you and this is your, domain. And then you could go through how things ran under, de Blasio and then Adams and seeing how it's going to be set up. And one of the things that we always talk about, kind of from the politics of hospitality and small business regulation is how do you break through what I call like that permanent bureaucracy is that Mayor-elect Mamdani has said he wants to reduce small business fines by 50%. That's fantastic. Good news is fines have been reduced under Adams. They were reduced under de Blasio. They actually skyrocketed under Bloomberg. In 2012, I think it was, health department fines peaked at about $53 million. When Bloomberg first came into office, they were about $12 million. Wow. So they skyrocketed from $12 million to about $53 million after he implemented the restaurant letter grade system. There was no real correlation between a reduction in foodborne illness, although the health department will say this or that, that we think justified that increase.
Mm-hmm.
What we've said to the mayor-elect, and I think he seems generally supportive, is, any small business fine that does not pose an immediate hazard to the public or to workers should allow for a warning or cure period before a fine is levied.
And I think that was something that Bill de Blasio stressed with Julie Menin helping orchestrate it as the commissioner at the time.
So I think there's, hope. And I think streamlining permitting licensing process so businesses can get open, they can expand faster. But if you have to be able to appoint people that can break through that, just permanent bureaucratic mentality or system where even what may seem like to an outside person such an easy fix can be so technical. Sometimes you have to go through rulemaking. Sometimes you have to go through the legislative process. Depends what is prioritized, what one internal lawyer in the city council or the administration says you can or cannot do. And then another gives a different interpretation. Yeah. So what seems easy can often be complicated. And his ability to, I think, break through all of that and really deliver on the small business reforms we want to see, but then also some of his big picture items is going to be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think, this is not at all a slight on, public employees, but, I think that at times there is not sort of the culture of accountability in agencies at times where that has to come from the mayor to the deputy mayor to the commissioner and then through the agency to say, here's the vision, here's where we want it to go. That not saying to break any laws or break any rules or any of that, but it is to break sometimes some of the morass or some of the old ways of doing things or to be a little uncomfortable with, new ways of doing things. And that is interesting to when you get a new mayor who will hire new people, how do they approach that atmosphere, set the tone on the policy, and then try to make sure it's implemented.
Yeah. And I think it's really important also for kind of the day-to-day civil servants because they're often in a very difficult position because it trickles down from the top. And going just back to small business fines is, it's very difficult. I have to imagine if I was an inspector and I go back to the office of whatever agency and the other inspectors have, several $1,000s of fines and then I have, only a couple hundred. It's like, well, were you not doing your job? Is something, going on? But that's why I've thought we actually need to restructure and reframe the way that we regulate and legislate. And if an inspector knew that all of these violations outside of those that are immediate hazard allowed and in fact required a warning or cure period, they would go in a different mind state. They'd be able to say, this is a violation, small business owner. This is why it's a violation. This is how to correct it. And we'll come back in 30 days, 60 days. And if it's not corrected, then you get a fine. But it goes from, an education and compliance first mentality versus what some people would argue has gotten better, but still is kind of a fine first.
Right. And I mean, you're making, you're making me jump to the idea of like quotas at the NYPD, which people, of course, don't want there to, most people don't want there to be arrest quotas that's what you're judged on. And this is about what are you managing? What are you measuring, right? What are the metrics of success and how do you have those determine a lot of the culture of what people are getting feedback on and accountability on. We're getting at also this discussion that goes back to, how a city government is run, which is there is a lot of discretion involved. Jump to policing. There's a huge amount of discretion involved in whether you give warnings, summonses, arrests, all of that is key to managing any agency. And, it gets more high profile in things like policing because you can actually, lock people up. But, you're talking about people's livelihoods in the restaurant industry or the nightlife industry. So, there's some big questions ahead. But to your point about, the Bloomberg management style, virtually everyone you talk to, I'm sure this is the case for you, or you hear talk about how do you run city government well, from basically the most progressive to the most conservative are like, you have to kind of do it how Bloomberg did it. And now that's not to say he was perfect or his commissioners were perfect by any means, but the behemoth of city government is almost hard to wrap your mind around in terms of what it has to do every day, 300,000 plus employees, all the different services and oversight and all of this, that you have to hire good people and mostly let them do their thing, especially if you want to be successful and get a lot done as a mayor. Now, will they make mistakes and you'll have to maybe acknowledge that sometimes, or will you hire a bad commissioner who's actually not cut out for that job and then you have to make a change and sort of eat a little crow on the cover of the tabloids? Yeah, but you can't micromanage New York City government. I mean, you just can't do it.
So what do you think the dynamic is? You know, you mentioned what the mayor does, what the city council does. The city council in the second week of January is going to elect the city council speaker. The presumptive speaker is council member Julie Menin from the Upper East Side. What's the city council speaker role in all of this? And then I want to talk about what we think the dynamic between the mayor and the city council is going to be.
Well, the city council speaker is a legislative leader of a body, like I said, of 51, so 50 plus the speaker, and you have to do a lot of consensus building to be a legislative leader. You don't get to just dictate. You know, the mayor in a lot of ways is a CEO, has to, of course, abide by lots of laws and rules and civil service and all of that, but has a lot of sort of centralized power. City council speaker has some power to dictate the agenda, but only, in a lot of ways so far as they have support within the body, right? So it's really about building consensus, relationships, but it is about leadership of that body. It's about making sure that the members are supported by the city council central staff. It's about taking their input into consideration around budget negotiations, about what legislation is going to move through the council. As I was saying, there's a huge number of bills that move. There's even more that get introduced. So the city council speaker has a lot of say over what bills advance, whether they get a hearing, and then after a hearing, whether they get a vote. But a lot of that does depend on how many of the members support that legislation. But the speaker, if it's a muscular, active speaker, can really have a lot of influence over the legislative agenda, the budget negotiations, their own vision for certain, issues and policies. And I expect Julie Menin to be a very assertive, muscular speaker.
I think so. Yeah, we had a good relationship with all the candidates. I've known Julie for, 20 plus years, and she actually owned a cafe, which she lost after 9/11 and the community board experience. Then we worked with her on, many, different agencies where she was a commissioner. So I think you're right that she is going to, assert herself in the role and, try to really leave, a legacy. And I'm hoping, this is not funny, but something I always talking about how much legislating they do and how much, things they are focused on. When it comes to our industry, restaurants, nightlife, it just seems like every single day there is like some new proposal that's going to micromanage the way small businesses operate. And I've joked around with a few friends in the council, and I've said, you want to just micromanage every single way a restaurant or bar operates? Like, why don't you just get out of government and open up your own restaurant or bar and you can run it however you want? But I do hope that there is, an organized effort to not just look at each bill that's introduced or maybe gets a hearing as a one-off. Because what we often say, it's not one rule or law that's going to put everyone out of business. It's kind of like death by 1,000 cuts. Right.
The regulations, the mandates.
Yeah. And then, one of the things talking about, perhaps with our mayor-elect, believing in government and, perhaps properly funding different agencies is one of the things I think you hear from small businesses constantly is not just small business fines or complicated regulations, but the private right lawsuits is that so many new laws, unfortunately, have a private right of action, meaning that the public can sue a business. So for minor technical violations where there's not like some gross miscarriage of, justice or something really bad happening, it ends up someone sues the small business. And then the business goes to their lawyer and they look at the case and they go, well, we could probably litigate this and we may be able to even win, but it's going to cost you $1 million. So you're better off just settling for $200,000, or it's going to cost you $300,000. Why don't you just settle now for $45,000? And our hope has always been no one wants to go through an audit or an investigation with an agency, but the cost to litigate and the cost of these private lawsuits is just devastating for small businesses. It also increases your insurance premiums.
Just about,
it
yeah.
makes it even more difficult to get access to different lines of insurance for coverage. And we said we'd rather have efficient and appropriate investigation from an agency versus just one lawsuit after another because it's been such a plague in the city.
So I'm a generalist and I'm not an expert on all the ins and outs of what you're talking about, but there seems to be a bit of consensus that a lot of that has gone too far or is too cumbersome, especially the insurance costs. And if you can point to why those insurance costs are rising, then you can sort of try to get at some of that as well. But we just had presumptive next council speaker, Julie Menin, in at the law school for a conversation that I did with Citizens Budget Commission President Andrew Ryan. And I asked her, what's sort of, obviously you want to work on childcare with Zohran Mamdani. Obviously housing is on everybody's list and affordable housing, but what else might be in the sort of Julie Menin focus areas? And this is exactly something she talked about, broadly speaking, is across the board in New York, there's been skyrocketing insurance rates, whether it's car insurance or anything else. And she talked about that. And then she talked about healthcare, which of course there's an insurance component there too, but just healthcare accessibility and costs in general. So she said some very interesting things on these lines. And I think, again, these are areas where it will be really interesting to see how a progressive mayor governs to be also business friendly, economic development minded and all of that, because there is clearly a growing consensus that there's some real problems with the insurance rates in New York across the board.
Brutal. I mean, we've had specific articles in the New York Times talking about how insurance rates are hurting nightlife venues, bars, nightclubs that are otherwise successful, but they just can't afford the insurance.
So here's the issue, right, that people should understand on a lot of this. So you have a very thoughtful person coming in to be mayor, a very thoughtful person coming in to be council speaker. To your point that, you're hopeful that the next speaker won't, in leading the legislative body, have them look at, each piece of legislation as a one-off, but really take in the totality. And Julie Menin's sort of the perfect person to be doing that because she has that type of mentality that she wants to understand the big picture and doesn't want. All that being said, people should understand, and this, that a lot of times legislation is passed because is a certain constituency, there's a certain interest that is driving that legislation really hard, and people care about the labor politics or, and again, not to say that legislation isn't necessarily good for a lot of people, but it's, there's a lot of cost benefit analysis to all of this, right? So it's certain constituencies, certain interests, and where you can have, really thoughtful people in these offices, but you have 15 council members who are saying, we really are invested in this bill for whatever other reasons, and you get new laws passed. So it is a very tricky balance. Even if you have people coming in with the right orientation, it's not always as simple as that.
Yeah, I'm hoping. I was appointed to Mayor-elect's transition committee on small business, MWBE, and I give him a lot of credit. Listen, there's a lot of different people that he could have appointed. I was honored to be appointed. I think there's a lot of things that we are going to agree on. Fixing outdoor dining, he's publicly supportive. We discussed reducing fines, streamlining the permitting and licensing process, investing in tourism, supporting small businesses during the World Cup. On the flip side, talks about the $30 minimum wage and tip credit elimination, which are state level issues, are frightening for small businesses. It would be bad for workers. There's a balance in all of this. But having us at the policy table is critically important. And we understand, you're not going to win everything, but you want to have people listening to you in a fair and thoughtful way and fully understanding the complexity of, all these issues. And I think there's other things which, I've spoken about publicly and privately, where things like public transportation, childcare, housing, these are small business issues. I mean, small business owners need places to live. Their employees need places to live. Childcare, particularly in the restaurant and nightlife industry, people leave the industry because of the nature of the business, because of not having access to childcare. Public safety. our workers. You close up a bar at 4 a.m. and you're taking the train home, the bus home, These are all things that are so important. Our customers, walking around the street. So I think there is a way to unify people about all of these big ticket items, also some of the smaller nuts and bolts issues where you may not always agree on them, but it doesn't have to be like, this is labor, this is business, this is, the progressives, this is everyone else. And I'm hoping that he, grows into that role and uses his excellent communication skills to really bring people. And I think he has an opportunity to surprise, people on both sides in a positive way, if that's really what he wants to do, and accomplish some big policy agenda items, but also just like the day-to-day things that people, deal with if you're a business owner with like a, random inspection.
Right.
And how it goes.
Well, I mean, I think you're getting at a lot of interesting tests that will be ahead for a new mayor of any kind. But, Zohran Mamdani clearly, as I think you're getting at in a lot of his transition approach and some of the just the few appointments that we know at the time we're speaking here, we see is that he is trying to take a balanced approach. He obviously has his politics and, things will lean more in that, sort of progressive direction. But he is at least coming in, I think, with an orientation where he wants to try to do a lot of the sort of everybody wins politics. Even when he's talking about things like the rent freeze on the rent stabilized apartments, he's saying, yes, I understand that there's a lot of building owners and landlords that are in significant trouble with their buildings, especially, the 100% rent stabilized buildings in the Bronx, for example. So how do you help them with their costs? If we want to help renters with the rent freeze, how do we help the landlords with their costs? And that's what you're getting at on the cut the fines, but maybe he wants to increase the minimum wage. Can you do it all? And if you do a bunch of it or you do it incrementally, how does it come out in the end in a net, way? Is it a net positive for everybody, or is there somebody, losing? Yeah,
and respecting. I mean, on the minimum wage point is we were involved over the past couple of years with the recent minimum wage, which is increasing again going into 2026, and our thought
and is indexed to inflation, which makes maybe you're going there.
Well, that's actually what we support, and I will say not everyone in the business community supported it, but we said people often think of like the business community as like it's a knee-jerk reaction no to anything, but we always try to be thoughtful in our approach. And we were okay. The minimum wage was increasing, but we thought that it should be indexed to inflation. Not everyone agreed, but we thought it would take the politics out of future minimum wage increases. Because inevitably what would happen is every 5 years or so, there's some big political fight about the minimum wage. It ultimately increases. The increases are different in different parts of the states, different in the schedule of how much it increases each year. And then when it hits, the final top tier amount. It's based on politics, not on economics. So we thought, that this would take the politics out of it. Future minimum wage increases are adjusted by inflation, and that's that. But now to come back and try to renegotiate all of that is frustrating, one. Two, it also candidly makes people in the business community, or probably any community, lose trust in a sense and be like, well, we came to the table in good faith. Everyone negotiated stuff. Some people got stuff they like. Other people got stuff they didn't like. Everyone kind of left a little happy and a little unhappy. And a new policy is enacted and we'll move on from there. But it kind of makes you feel, well, why should I ever come to the policy table and compromise and negotiate in good faith if I know the following year it's going to be like, we gotcha. Now we're back to change it. And I think these are some of the more big picture policy ideas and concepts that not just an incoming administration, but all people in government need to negotiate and consider because, things don't start right when you get into government. There's a history. Right. And I think it's important to show people that government can work. It can work well. It can be responsive to people's needs and concerns, but it's not always knee-jerk. And we don't just do things so quickly because it's politically expedient at the time. And I'm hoping that, you know, as leaders, both of the mayor-elect and Julie Menin, presumptive speaker, that they will look at governing like this. We have an awesome responsibility to New Yorkers, and we need to make sure that we're doing it in a thoughtful, strategic, and effective way, and not just try to do everything, but let's do a handful of things that will help people and do it in the right way and do it well.
Well, to that point, I do think that's the orientation the mayor-elect comes in with. He's got his top issues that he ran on. $30 minimum wage by 2030, by the way, not, you know, next year, but that's not that far off. And has to be negotiated for it to happen. But, you know, he's got his top issues. He did run on that, but that was not in that top menu. It's not part of the call and response that the voters know and his supporters know, right? That's childcare, rent freeze. And so, you know, and the buses, of course. And so, you know, I do think those will be the other debates that will be had, but he will be focused on his top promises because he seems acutely aware, like many people coming into elected office of any kind, that you got to deliver on the top things you promise to some degree. But he's even, you know, I think taken a very, what I would say is sort of realistic and refreshing approach to saying, we're not going to get everything we ran on even overnight. This might take a term, you know, this might take 2 terms. And, you know, things need to be incremental. And so to your point, I think there is some of that sort of realistic thinking, pragmatic thinking, even from someone who ran on a pretty bold, you know, agenda from the further left.
And then universal childcare, just, I mean, even outside of my seat with the Hospitality Alliance, I think is one of those legacy policies similar to, you know, universal, you know, pre-K. And listen, we have public high school and middle school and elementary school and now childcare, you know, pre-K, and then childcare seems like an extension of that. And I think just people across all spectrums of, you know, class and the economy, I hope would be able to rally around that. And then building the housing and having people be able to, you know, live here. You know, we talk about restaurants and we talk about workers, but we also talk about like the creative economy. And when you think about like live music, think about the type of music and bands and hip hop and everything that originated out of that. So much of it is tied to restaurants, nightlife, you know,
but having a city that people trying to get into, make it, you know, to make it here can
you
afford,
want to move
right?
here and be a musician,
so,
you know, like it's
and Zohran Mamdani, you know, he understands that as someone, again, you know, he came obviously from a fairly privileged background, but he was, you know, trying to make it as a 20-something rapper and, you know, all of that. So I think, you know, he has a sense of that. But again, that gets to on the housing. Is he really going to embrace an all of the above approach? Does he really understand, even coming in as a democratic socialist, that you got, you know, he said this in an interview with the New York Times, that he's changed his mind on the role of the private market in that, you know, in the housing, in the overall housing market. Is he really willing to sort of say, yes, I support that, you know, 100% market rate building, but we got to do a lot of other 100% affordable buildings, and have an all of the above approach, you know, is so key to the future of the city. Also, just quickly on the childcare, you made me think, you know, of this question, especially with your, you know, industry being 24/7, is, you know, how do you think about childcare? Maybe not 24/7, but beyond, you know, 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. certainly, right? It's not just the school day that people need childcare. So how do you think about that, and what does that look like, and, you know, how do you stand that system up? And they've got big questions ahead about even taking the city's current childcare system, which is this hodgepodge of contracted stuff and vouchers, and some of it's connected to the city and some of it's just, you know, the city paying elsewhere and helping people who can't afford. You know, how do you stand up a universal system is, you know.
And a lot of this, like we were saying, the complexity of government, what the mayor can do on their own, what they need the city council for, but some of this is going to require the state of New York and the governor and the state legislature, which adds a whole other complicated layer. So, you know, doing anything is complicated, but listen, I think whatever people's politics are, at the end of the day, you know, people want a city that is more affordable, where, you know, the systems are delivered and they work. And you may have, you know, differences on specific policies, but overall you want the, you know, city to succeed and be a place where people can stay and come. What about, let's talk about food a little bit.
All right.
So Jugood, you're out writing and working, you go out, you have any go-to meals you've had in the past couple months?
So I will just broadly say, I work at New York Law School, and so I'm around there in Tribeca a lot, and there's a lot of good restaurants over there. So I occasionally get a chance to do that. But I live kind of at the intersection of Flatbush, Ditmas, and Kensington in Brooklyn, and I have a almost 9-year-old. So we're, going out for pizza and different things like that in the neighborhood. And there's a really good, spot near us called Weeded for a, nice pizza right around the corner. So, little of this, little of that, but it's a lot of, sometimes going out with colleagues or friends, and I always enjoy a Chinatown trip and whether it's lunch or dinner. So
that's the thing that I love about, kind of restaurants and nightlife. I feel like no matter what world you're in, people connect. They have like their go-to Chinese spot or pizzeria, or they have some memories of going to some place when they were a kid. What about your podcast, Max Politics? Yeah. So I imagine you do some of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Usually
I'm asking the questions.
I know. We've turned the tables here. Any really interesting interviews that you've conducted recently that have kind of stood out, or specific comments people have made?
Yeah, well, I will say for people, I mentioned this event we had at the law school with the presumptive next council speaker, Julie Menin. We put the audio of that in the podcast feed so people can find it there if they'd like. I also moderated at the law school a different live event. We put the audio in the podcast feed on keys to a successful mayoral transition. And I had 4 veterans of the last 3 administrations, not all 3, but 4 a sampling, former deputy mayors and counsel to the mayor and so forth with me there. But then directly just on the podcast, I had a really interesting conversation in September with the school's chancellor, Melissa Vilas Ramos, who is now pretty openly lobbying to stay on as chancellor. She's only been in the job a year or so. So that was a very interesting conversation on education policy. So that those are a few highlights of stuff in the feed, but I do a lot of in-depth conversations with elected and appointed officials. One more that's probably of interest to your listeners and viewers especially is I just talked to the guy who runs the mayor's office of special enforcement that educates and does enforcement around the Airbnb and other short-term rental laws. So probably not the biggest hero of the industry at all, but a very interesting guy. And, it's his job to do a lot of education and implementation around these pretty restrictive laws that have really constricted the short-term rental market in the city. And we got into a lot about, he's not a policymaker, he's an education and enforcement guy, but Christian Klosner is his name.
Sure. No, I've known Christian for
so we had a good long talk
for many years on a lot of different issues. But listen, it's that education, first approach that we've always been encouraging. And I will say,
which
in fairness, I think the city under multiple administrations now has gotten better, but there's always, more work to do. And I hope this administration, incoming administration, is really going to focus on figuring out what hasn't been fixed that could be fixed, and even looking at what they're doing now that you could say they're doing right, but continue to improve it and make it even better, constantly refining itself. So real quick, because you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, just in a minute, the end of the Eric Adams mayoralty, what do you think the legacy is going to be now? I mean, not now, but in a couple of years. It's been such an interesting 4 years and how this played out, and he announced that he's not going to seek another term. How do you think people are going to look back at it in the next few years? Yeah, I mean, I think it depends if you're giving the really, sort of 1 minute version versus, a little bit more depth than that. I mean, I think the real short version is sort of a tragic story, unfortunately. A one-term mayor who came in with a lot of promise and a huge mandate and a lot of energy and really wanted to be mayor so badly and, had a decades-long plan to be mayor and, did a lot of things to get ready to take the job. And he kind of wanted to be a blend of, Dinkins and Giuliani and Bloomberg and de Blasio and all the best, but, really just struggled in a lot of ways. And of course was the first ever sitting mayor to be indicted. I mean, the one-term mayor and the first mayor to be indicted will be at the top, unfortunately, for the city and for him in the history books. But beyond that, I think there's the legacy of Eric Adams will be probably pretty quick after that.
you add to that sort of oversaw an administration with a lot of bad hires and people resigning and other people being investigated. There was a lot of challenges here. But so you take that bucket, but then beyond that, I would say the second thing there will be he did a lot of good housing policy.
Yes.
And I think that's basically going to be the top two lines. If you get into the substance a bit beyond some of that, there'll be that. I also give him credit for some of what he's done on economic development. I think largely through sort of EDC with like city-owned sites and things like that. He's obviously, as we discussed, been also a champion for the city in tourism and nightlife and all that. But I think, what they've done at EDC has been good on economic development. He'll be remembered for the literacy overhaul in the city schools, which again, needs good implementation, but was a key trademark there. And then lastly, I have to mention, the big crisis other than his own self-inflicted one, he had the migrant crisis. Yes. So that will be towards the top of the discussion about his legacy. Yeah. I would, in brief, give him pretty mixed marks on that. I think in a lot of the logistical humanitarian ways, they did a lot of good stuff because they had over 200,000 people arrive who needed help. They weren't perfect on that, but that was an emergency situation and they did a lot of good things to help people. But on the bigger picture, how he talked about it publicly, I don't think it was, he had his finest hour, in some of the divisive ways he talked about it. He was very frustrated, rightfully so, that the federal government wasn't helping more, but he still created an atmosphere in the city that I think, is part of the demerits on that one.
Yeah, no, listen, and putting aside some of the first parts that we were talking about is, these crises and, every mayor has a crisis. You never know what the crisis is going to be. You never know when in your administration it's going to hit, and it can totally derail everything else you're trying to do and take the air out of the room because you need to focus on responding to it. And I think those are kind of the big unknowns that, every city and every, mayor and city council will find themselves in.
Which gets back to part of how we started, which is, you have to be a leader and a manager and you have to appoint a lot of the right people. You have to appoint people in mind of, can they implement my agenda, but also will they be able to manage in a crisis?
I mean, I know the one thing from our perspective was it was so nice to have a mayor who was out there talking about nightlife, really listened to these different things and wanted to do the right thing and did a lot of good things. Even in the city of it was removing the restrictions on dancing, which was related to the historically racist cabaret law that was used to shut down nightlife venues. And then start issuing fines and, all these, closing orders to places over the years. So he did, a lot there. And then we'll see how history judges him and see, with our new mayor-elect and new council, how we're going to, move along.
Yeah. Forgive me. I should have said something also. Of course, Eric Adams was elected to be the public safety mayor. Yes. So I should have also included, part of the reason I think he was in some trouble even before he got indicted is people didn't see a fast enough decrease in the crime issues in the city. And eventually they made more progress on that. And we're seeing some really encouraging signs. But, he was elected to do that first and foremost because of the COVID era crime spike. And so that'll be a key part of that. I always say,
running a restaurant nights, weekends, holidays, just a million fires to always put out. It is a tough job, but I think probably the only tougher job may be being mayor of the city of New York. So
absolutely.
Ben Max, the host of Max Politics. I hope we can have this conversation maybe in like 6 months or so when the new administration is in there and start getting their ground and implementing some policies, and hopefully it'll be good stuff we can talk about and you can report on.
This was great. Thanks for having me. And you'll have to, come do that conversation on my show too, because then I get to ask you the questions.
Would love it. This is Hospitality and Politics, powered by the New York City Hospitality Alliance. We will see you next time.